They were already reaching for his bag when the captain's voice cut through the cabin. "So step away from the aisle. Right now." The words landed hard, sharp as metal on bone. Conversations died mid-sentence. A champagne flute froze halfway to someone's lips. The overhead bins hummed, then went silent like the plane itself was holding its breath. David Carter didn't move. He stood beside seat 2, one hand resting lightly on the headrest, the other hanging loose at his side. No clenched fists, no raised voice. Just stillness, the kind that makes people uneasy because it refuses to explain itself. The flight attendant's fingers were still hooked through the strap of his carry-on. She felt it. The weight. Heavier than it looked. She hesitated, then let go as if the bag had burned her. Around them, first class had turned into a narrow stage. Leather seats, polished wood, soft amber lighting. The quiet luxury of people used to being protected from discomfort, from scenes like this. Brian Mitchell, chief flight attendant, stood a step behind the captain, his jaw tight, a thin pulse beating just below his ear. He had rehearsed this 100 times in his head, just not like this. Not with a captain involved, not with passengers watching this closely. David looked at neither of them. His eyes were fixed on the small crack in the overhead panel above seat 2C, a hairline fracture, barely visible unless you were trained to notice stress points. His breathing stayed even, but his chest felt tight like the air had thickened. 14 minutes earlier, none of this had existed. 14 minutes earlier, David Carter had boarded North Sky Airlines Flight 817 from Atlanta to Seattle, like any other man in his late 50s traveling alone on a Tuesday morning. Grey button-down, dark slacks, comfortable shoes worn at the heel. No watch anyone would recognize. No logo. No shine. He moved with the slow, economical confidence of someone who didn't rush because nothing chased him anymore. At the door, the greeting had been polite. Not warm. Not cold. Just practiced. The flight attendant's eyes flicked down his clothes, then back up too quickly, like she'd caught herself doing something impolite. Welcome aboard. No name. No smile that reached the eyes. David turned left into first class, the narrow aisle opening into space. He found seat 2C window side. His seat. He placed his bag under the console, sat buckled and exhaled. The seat creaked softly under his weight. Old leather, well maintained. He glanced out the window, watching ground crew move beneath the wing. Routine. Predictable. Safe. Or so it looked. Brian noticed him almost immediately. Not because David stood out, but because he didn't. Brian had worked this route for nearly 2 decades. He knew the regulars by posture alone. The way they walked, the way they claimed space, the way they expected to be recognized. David did none of that. Brian watched him from the galley, pretending to check a manifest he already knew by heart. Seat 2C. First class. Booked less than 48 hours ago. No loyalty tag attached. No profile notes. No preferences logged. That more than anything bothered him. Thomas Reynolds boarded moments later. 61. Tall. Silver hair combed back with care. Custom blazer. Shoes polished within an inch of their lives. He paused at the door like a man entering his own office, nodding once to the crew. Morning, Brian. Brian's face changed instantly. Shoulders relaxed. Smile real now. Good morning, Mr. Reynolds. Welcome back. Thomas stepped into the aisle, glanced toward row 2, then stopped. That's odd, he said lightly, but his eyes hardened. Someone's in my seat. Brian followed his gaze. 2C. For a moment, no one spoke. The plane continued boarding around them. Wheels of carry-ons clicked against the floor. Somewhere a child laughed in economy. Life went on indifferent. I'll take care of it, Brian said. He approached David with the practiced calm of a man who believed problems could be smoothed out if you spoke softly enough. Sir, he said, lowering his voice, there appears to be a seating issue. This seat is typically reserved for one of our frequent travelers. David looked up slowly. His eyes were dark, steady, assessing. I purchased this seat, he said. His voice was quiet, unhurried. It's on my boarding pass. Brian smiled the way you do when you're trying to convince someone you're on their side while already deciding they're wrong. Yes, of course. We just need to make a small adjustment. We can accommodate you in another first-class seat. David shook his head once. Small. Final. I'm comfortable here. That was when the air shifted. Thomas had moved closer now, standing in the aisle, with the easy confidence of a man used to watching others step aside. He looked down at David not with anger, but with disbelief, like someone encountering a clerical error that had learned how to speak. I fly this route every week, Thomas said. That seat has always been mine. David met his gaze. Today it isn't. The words were simple, factual. They landed harder than any insult. Around them, people pretended not to listen while listening to everything. A woman across the aisle pressed her lips together, eyes darting between the men. A man 2 rows back slowly removed his earbuds, curiosity winning over discretion. Brian felt sweat gather at the base of his spine. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He leaned closer to David, his tone sharpening despite himself. Sir, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to escalate this. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He simply said, I am cooperating. I'm seated, buckled, following every instruction that applies. That was when Brian made the mistake. He glanced toward the cockpit. He caught the captain's eye and nodded. The captain, Mark Sullivan, 57 former Navy, stepped out moments later. He took in the scene with a single sweep of his eyes. 2 men, one standing, one seated. A crew member visibly tense. Passengers alert. Phones just beginning to rise. What's going on? He asked. Before Brian could answer, David spoke. Captain, he said evenly, before we resolve the seating issue, I need to report something. The captain turned to him, irritation flickering. This isn't the time. It is, David said, because it affects your aircraft. A ripple moved through the cabin. Brian felt his stomach drop. David turned his head slightly, angling his chin toward the window. There's a fluid trail along the left wing route, amber in color. It's not condensation. It's spreading. The captain hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. Long enough. Brian laughed softly, too quickly. So passengers often mistake hydraulic fluid doesn't evaporate like water, David said. Calm. Precise. And it doesn't form beads like that. Silence. The captain stepped closer to the window, leaned, squinted. Something dark crossed his face. "Brian," he said slowly, "get maintenance." And that was the moment David Carter stopped being just another man in an unremarkable shirt. Not because he revealed who he was, but because the plane did. The cabin no longer felt luxurious. It felt fragile, pressurized, a sealed tube full of people who suddenly understood how thin the line was between routine and disaster. David sat back in his seat, pulse-steady eyes still on the wing. 14 minutes had passed since Brian first asked him to move, and nothing about North Sky Airlines would be the same once those minutes were fully accounted for. Maintenance arrived without sirens or urgency, just two men in grey coveralls walking up the jet bridge like they were late for lunch. That calm was almost worse. It suggested routine. It suggested this happened often enough to feel ordinary. Captain Sullivan stood at the cockpit door, arms crossed, watching them approach. His jaw was set, the way it had been when he'd first learned to land on carriers at night. He didn't like surprises. He liked even less the kind that came from someone he almost ignored. David Carter stayed seated. Seatbelt fastened, hands folded loosely in his lap. His eyes followed the mechanics as they moved past him toward the wing view. He could feel the tension radiating from Brian Mitchell, 2 rows up, feel it like static in the air. The first mechanic leaned in close to the window, wiping a small circle clear with the back of his glove. He stared longer than Brian was comfortable with. Too long. He said nothing at first, just nodded once, slow, to his partner. The second mechanic exhaled through his nose. "That's not water." Brian felt heat rush to his face. "It's probably residual from ground operations," he said too quickly. "We get condensation all the time." The first mechanic straightened, finally turning his head toward Brian. His eyes were tired, professional, not impressed. "Condensation doesn't move against gravity." A murmur rippled through the cabin, low, uncontrolled. People shifted in their seats. Someone behind David whispered a prayer under their breath. Captain Sullivan stepped forward. "How bad?" The mechanic hesitated. That hesitation carried weight. "I'm not signing off on this aircraft." Silence fell like a dropped plate. Brian's mouth opened, then closed. His throat felt dry. "We haven't even run diagnostics. We don't need diagnostics to ground it," the mechanic replied. "We need diagnostics to understand how lucky we just got." David closed his eyes for half a second. Not in relief, in calculation. The captain nodded once. Decisive now. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the intercom moments later, his voice steady but stripped of warmth. "We are delaying departure for further inspection. Please remain seated until instructed." Phones came out immediately. Not to record David. Not yet. To text spouses, to update calendars, to complain, to search news for any hint of what might be happening. Fear doesn't always scream. Sometimes it scrolls. Thomas Reynolds sank into seat 1D, his face pale beneath the tan. He hadn't said a word since the mechanic spoke. His confidence had drained out of him, leaving behind something brittle and exposed. He looked once at David, really looked this time, then looked away. Brian retreated toward them. The galley, his mind racing faster than the aircraft ever would today. This had gone off the rails. He replayed the first moment he'd noticed David. The clothes, the lack of markers, the assumption that had slid into place so easily, he hadn't even felt it happen. He told himself he'd just been following patterns. That was always the excuse. The delay stretched. Minutes felt longer when the door was closed and the ground crew gathered beneath the wing like ants around a crack in concrete. David watched them through the window, noting the way their movements shifted from casual to precise. Tools came out. Flashlights, tablets. Someone shook their head. The captain returned to the cabin, stopping beside David's row. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, looking out the window. Then quietly, "You have experience." It wasn't a question. David met his eyes. "I used to. With aircraft?" "With systems," David said. "Aircraft are just systems that punish arrogance." The captain almost smiled. "Almost. You saved us some time, or you saved yourselves by listening." David replied. The captain nodded, absorbing that. He turned and walked away without another word. An announcement came shortly after. Passengers would need to deplane. The aircraft was grounded, pending a full review. Groans filled the cabin, followed by the scrape of seat belts and the clatter of bags. People stood too fast, as if movement itself could restore control. As David rose, Brian found himself blocking the aisle. Not intentionally. His body just moved there, drawn by something between fear and shame. Sir Brian said, voice low, "I need to ask you something." David waited. "Why didn't you just move seats?" The question was raw, stripped of policy, of procedure, of authority. David looked at him for a long moment. Around them, passengers squeezed past, eyes flicking between the two men, sensing unfinished business. "Because I wanted to see what would happen," David said finally. "And because moving would have made everything you did feel justified." Brian swallowed. "That wasn't my intention." "I know," David said. "That's what makes it dangerous." They stood there, suspended in that truth, until a gate agent called out for them to clear the aisle. In the terminal, the story began to mutate. A woman near the windows spoke animatedly into her phone, her voice rising. "No, they tried to move him. Yes, first class. And then the plane got grounded." Another man shook his head, already drafting an email he would never send. "I've been flying since the 70s, he muttered. "Never seen anything like this." Security hovered at a distance, uncertain. This wasn't a shouting match. No one was out of control. That made it harder. They didn't know where to put their hands. David leaned against a pillar, his bag at his feet, listening to the murmur swell around him. He could feel the moment slipping out of the airline's grasp. Once stories reached daylight, they rarely returned intact. His phone vibrated. One message, no name, just a number he knew by heart. "Aircraft grounded." David typed back with his thumb. "One aircraft. For now." The reply came almost instantly. "Send details." David hesitated. This wasn't how he'd planned it. He'd expected indifference, pushback, maybe a quiet note in a report that would sit unread for months. He hadn't expected a mechanic to say, "Not signing off." He hadn't expected the captain to listen. He typed slowly. Potential hydraulic issue. Initial dismissal. Escalated after confirmation. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. We need to talk. Across the terminal, Thomas Reynolds sat alone, now his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, controlled, but there was a tremor beneath it. No, I don't care about the seat anymore. The plane didn't fly. That's the headline. He paused, listening. His shoulders sagged slightly. I don't know who he is, he said, but I don't think this ends here. Brian stood near the gate desk, arms crossed, tightly staring at the floor. He replayed the moment he'd laughed off David's concern. The sound of it. Short, dismissive. He imagined it played back on a loop, stripped of context, broadcast to strangers who would see only what it was. Emily Rogers, the younger flight attendant, approached him cautiously. You okay? Brian nodded automatically, then shook his head. No. She followed his gaze to David. He wasn't trying to make us look bad. I know, Brian said. That's what scares me. An airport announcement crackled overhead, listing delays and apologies in a voice that had learned how to sound sincere without meaning it. North Sky Flight 817 officially cancelled. Passengers eligible for rebooking and accommodations. David pushed off the pillar and walked toward the windows. Outside, the aircraft sat motionless, a bright line of fluid still visible if you knew where to look. He thought about how easily it could have been missed, how often things like that were. He thought about all the times he'd been told to move along, to wait, to trust the system. His phone vibrated again. This time a name appeared. We're convening an emergency call. David looked back at the gate, at Brian, at Thomas, at the passengers still buzzing with a story they didn't fully understand yet. He typed one word. Good. Because the truth was already moving faster than any plane ever could. The call came through as David stood watching a tug idle beside the grounded aircraft, its engine ticking as it cooled. Get somewhere quiet, the voice said. Now. He moved without hurry, weaving through the terminal to a glass-walled conference room, meant for delayed crews and overbooked apologies. The door shut behind him with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. He set his bag down, loosened his collar, and took the call. They didn't waste time. The captain filed a report. The voice continued. Maintenance logged it as a confirmed hydraulic seep with unknown origin. That alone would have triggered a review. But the way it was handled before that is what got attention. David leaned against the table eyes on the faint reflection of his own face in the glass. Older than most people guessed. Tired in a way that came from watching the same patterns repeat in different rooms with different names on the doors. How far up, he asked. A pause. Then far enough that it won't stay contained. Outside, a cluster of passengers gathered near the windows, pointing, speculating. A rumor had already formed, growing limbs and teeth. Someone had been moved. Someone had refused. Someone had spotted something dangerous. The details didn't matter as much as the feeling. People knew something wasn't right. Across the terminal, Brian Mitchell sat alone on a bench meant for short waits, hands clasped between his knees. His shoulders were hunched, posture collapsed inward like a man bracing for impact. He replayed the words again and again. Condensation. Nothing to worry about. He'd said them so many times over the years, reflexively, the way a body shields itself from cold. Emily stood nearby, pretending to scroll through her phone while watching him from the corner of her eye. She had seen this before. Men like Brian didn't unravel loudly. They folded in on themselves, quietly convinced that silence was still control. At the far end of the gate, Thomas Reynolds paced while speaking into his phone, the polished certainty in his voice wearing thin. "No, I'm not blaming anyone," he said, though the words carried blame anyway. "I'm saying this shouldn't have happened. We pay for consistency." He stopped pacing when he saw David exit the conference room. For a brief moment, something like recognition flickered across Thomas's face. Not familiarity. Something else. The unsettling sense that he had misjudged the shape of the room he was standing in. David didn't acknowledge him. He headed instead toward the windows, his phone still warm in his hand. The call had ended with a single sentence that hadn't needed explanation. "This will escalate." Behind him, Brian rose and followed, stopping a few steps back. "Sir," he said, voice hoarse. "David." The name landed differently now. Less generic. More deliberate. David turned. Brian swallowed. His eyes were red-rimmed, but his gaze held. "I need to know something," he said. "Are we in trouble because of what I did, or because of what I didn't do?" David studied him, the lines at the corners of Brian's mouth, the exhaustion beneath the uniform, the decades of habits built under pressure. "You're in trouble because the system you trusted rewarded speed over judgment," David said. "You're responsible for your part. So is everyone else." Brian nodded slowly. "That doesn't feel like an answer." "It's the only one that lasts," David replied. A shout rippled through the terminal. Phones lifted higher. Someone had recognized something. A name, maybe. Or a face matched to an article. Or a stock symbol whispered into a search bar. Emily's phone buzzed. She glanced down, then up at David, eyes widening. "They're grounding more flights," she said quietly. "Not just ours." The air changed again. Thomas turned sharply. "What do you mean? More flights?" Emily hesitated. She wasn't authorized to say anything, but the truth had a way of slipping out once it smelled daylight. "Maintenance flagged similar patterns on 2 other aircraft," she said. "They're doing checks." Thomas's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, then closed his eyes briefly, like a man absorbing a blow he'd seen coming. When he opened them, the entitlement was gone, replaced by calculation. "This is going to get ugly," he said, more to himself than anyone else. David watched the tug pull away from the aircraft, leaving it exposed wings, wattu and inert. He thought about leverage, about how it was built, about how most people never realized they were standing on it until the ground shifted. His phone vibrated again, this time a secure line. He answered without speaking. "We're moving to a fleet-level hold," the voice said. "Temporary, precautionary. But it's happening." David closed his eyes. Not in triumph, in acceptance. "How are they framing it?" he asked. "As maintenance irregularities pending review," the voice replied. "Internally, it's already more than that." David exhaled slowly. "Then you need to widen the lens." This can't be about a single call or a single crew. That's why we're calling you, the voice said. Your report from last quarter. The patterns you flagged. They line up. David opened his eyes and looked straight at Brian. At Emily, at Thomas, at the passengers who were now openly filming, narrating their own versions of events. You'll get what you need, David said. But don't make this about me. A beat. Too late for that, the voice replied. The call ended. Thomas approached him, then careful now, each step measured. I don't know who you are, he said. But I know this isn't random. David met his gaze. You don't need to know who I am, he said. You need to understand what you represent. Thomas frowned. And what's that a system that assumes it can decide who matters faster than it can decide what's true? David replied. Thomas's jaw tightened. You think I caused this? I think you benefited from it, David said. Until today. Thomas looked away, eyes scanning the terminal. The cameras, the staff. That's not fair. David's voice didn't rise. Neither was almost flying with a compromised control system. A uniformed manager hurried toward them, breathless phone pressed to her ear. She stopped short when she saw David recognition sparking fully now. Her eyes widened. Her posture changed. Sir, she said, then corrected herself. Mr. Carter. Brian noticed. Emily noticed. Thomas noticed. The name moved through the space like a current. David didn't correct her. He didn't stop her. He simply nodded once. The manager lowered her voice. Corporate is requesting your presence. Immediately. David glanced around the terminal one last time. At the grounded plane. At the people whose routines had been broken. At the crew whose habits were about to be examined under unforgiving light. Tell them I'll join the call, he said. But I'm not doing this behind closed doors. The manager hesitated. Sir, if this gets fixed quietly, David continued, it stays broken. Outside, a line of aircraft sat nose to tail on the tarmac engines, dark wings still. One by one, operations halted the ripple, spreading outward unstoppable now. Brian watched it happen with a mixture of dread and clarity. He understood something then that no training manual had ever taught him. This wasn't punishment. It was exposure. Emily felt it too. A strange steadiness beneath the fear, like the ground had finally stopped lying. Thomas checked his phone again, reading the first headlines forming the language cautious but unmistakable. Fleet hold. Safety review. Passenger report validated. He looked at David, truly looked this time, and for the first time felt small. David stepped toward the conference room again, his stride unhurried, shoulders squared. The weight in his bag hadn't changed, but everything else had. Behind him, the terminal buzzed with the sound of a system waking up to itself, and somewhere deep inside North Sky Airlines, a decision was being made that could not be undone. The conference room filled with faces that had never expected to share the same frame. They appeared one by one on the screen, rectangles lighting up in sterile blues and grays, men and women in tailored jackets, silver hair, careful smiles that vanished the moment the door closed behind David. Someone muted themselves too late. Someone else forgot to turn off their camera, and stared down at their own hands, knuckles white. David placed his bag on the table and remained standing. Across the digital grid, the interim chief operating officer cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, thank you for joining on such short notice." David didn't sit. He didn't respond immediately. He looked at the faces, counted them, noted who was missing. Power always revealed itself as much through absence as presence. "You grounded the fleet," David said. The words were not accusatory. They were a statement. Heavy. Final. A woman in the top row leaned forward. "Temporarily," she said, "out of an abundance of caution." David tilted his head slightly. That phrase usually appears after something goes wrong. Not before. Silence. Captain Sullivan's face appeared in a smaller window, his posture, rigid eyes, steady. He said nothing. He didn't need to. "We're still assessing the scope," the COO said carefully. "At this point, we don't believe there's an immediate systemic failure." David finally took a seat. The chair creaked softly under him. The sound felt loud in the room. "You didn't believe there was an issue on Flight 817 either," he said, "until a mechanic refused to sign his name." A man with a tight smile spoke up, with respect that was an isolated incident. David leaned back, folding his hands. "Then explain." "The other two aircraft pulled from rotation this morning. Explain the maintenance logs from the past 18 months that flagged minor leaks, sensor inconsistencies, and deferred inspections, all cleared under operational pressure." The tight smile disappeared. "You've been reviewing our internal data," someone said sharply. "I've been reviewing trends," David replied. "There's a difference." The COO's voice softened, strategic now. "We understand you were on that flight as part of a private assessment." David nodded once. "Yes. And you didn't disclose that to the crew." The COO continued. "No," David said, "because disclosure changes behavior. And I wasn't there to see your best version. I was there to see the default." The room shifted. Chairs creaked. A cough. A pen tapped nervously against a desk. Outside the conference room, Brian Mitchell stood with his back to the glass arms crossed tight against his chest. He could see the silhouettes inside, could feel the gravity of the conversation without hearing a word. Every few seconds, he glanced down at his hands like they might betray him further. Emily stood beside him, quiet, present. "They're talking about procedures," she said softly. "Not people." Brian laughed without humor. "That's how it always starts." Inside the room, the COO spoke again. "Mr. Carter, grounding the entire fleet is an extreme measure. The financial implications alone are survivable." David interrupted. His voice remained calm, but something colder edged into it now. "What isn't survivable is a pattern of near misses treated as noise." A woman on the board bristled. "Are you suggesting we're negligent?" David's eyes met the camera directly. "I'm suggesting you've trained your people to prioritize departure times over discomfort, reputation over curiosity, authority over listening." "That's an unfair characterization." The man with the tight smile snapped. David leaned forward. "Your chief flight attendant dismissed a credible safety concern because it came from a passenger who didn't fit his mental model of expertise. That same instinct has cleared how many deferred items no one answered. Captain Sullivan finally spoke. "If I hadn't looked," he said quietly, "we would have taken off." The room went still. The COO closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the confidence was gone. "We need a plan," he said, "publicly and internally." David nodded. "You need honesty." "A beat." "Those are not the same thing," the COO replied. "They are, if you want this to end," David said. Outside, Thomas Reynolds watched the glass wall with mounting dread. His phone buzzed incessantly, messages stacking up faster than he could read. Investors, partners, journalists. He felt the ground tilt beneath him, the familiar structures suddenly unreliable. Inside the conference room, the woman who had spoken earlier leaned closer to her camera. "What exactly are you proposing?" David exhaled slowly. A full stop. Not just the fleet. The assumptions. Independent audits. External oversight. A review board with real authority, not a symbolic one. "That could take months," someone protested. "It should," David replied. "You've been compressing risk for years. Expanding it back out will take time." "And your role in this?" the COO asked carefully. David didn't hesitate. "I'll stay involved until the system can function without me. Then I'll step back." The man with the tight smile scoffed. "You expect us to hand operational control to an outsider?" David's gaze sharpened. "I'm not an outsider. I'm a stakeholder who just watched your safeguards fail in real time." Another silence. He let it stretch. Silence was a tool if you knew how to use it. Finally, the COO nodded. "We'll need formal authorization." "You'll get it," David said. "You already have the votes." The realization hit them all at once. The subtle shift. The way power rearranged itself quietly without ceremony. The call ended not with agreement, but with inevitability. David stood and gathered his bag. As he opened the door, the noise of the terminal rushed back in chaotic and human. Brian turned immediately. "They're grounding everything," Brian said, voice tight. David met his eyes. "They're pausing," he said. "There's a difference. What happens next decides which word history uses." Brian swallowed. "Am I done?" David studied him for a long moment. "That depends on what you do when you're no longer protected by habit." Brian nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "Not relief. Responsibility." Emily stepped forward. "They asked me for a statement," she said. "About what I saw." "Tell the truth," David said, "even if it costs you comfort." She straightened. "Okay." Across the terminal, Thomas Reynolds watched the exchange and felt something crack inside him. Not anger. Recognition. He approached cautiously, like a man entering unfamiliar terrain. "I owe you an apology," he said to David. "For assuming." David looked at him, expression unreadable. "Apologies don't undo systems," he said. "But they can stop feeding them." Thomas nodded, eyes downcast. "I'll be answering some questions," he said quietly. "Sooner than I expected." "Yes," David replied. "You will." An announcement echoed overhead, its tone carefully neutral. Additional cancellations, safety reviews, apologies on behalf of North Sky Airlines. Passengers groaned. Others cheered softly. Some simply stared at their phones, absorbing a moment they'd talk about for years without ever fully understanding it. David walked toward the windows one last time. Outside aircraft sat motionless, their stillness no longer a sign of failure, but of restraint. Of a system finally forced to look at itself without flinching. Behind him, the terminal buzzed with confusion and anger and hope, all tangled together. Ahead of him, a long process waited. Slow, unforgiving, necessary. David adjusted the strap of his bag and stepped back into the noise, carrying with him the weight of a truth that could no longer be ignored. The first lawsuit threat arrived before the press release was finished. David heard about it not from the news, but from the low murmur of voices bleeding through the thin wall of the temporary operations office North Sky had converted into a war room. Lawyers spoke differently when they were afraid. Shorter sentences, fewer adjectives, more caveats. He sat alone at the end of the table jacket, draped over the back of his chair, sleeves rolled to the forearms. The room smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air. Someone had scribbled timelines on a whiteboard that was already too small to hold what was coming. A door opened, closed. Footsteps approached. They're saying wrongful delay, loss of income, reputational harm. The COO said, dropping into a chair across from him. His tie was loosened now, the knot sitting crooked like it had given up. That's just the opening round. David didn't look up from the maintenance report spread in front of him. They're supposed to say that he replied. It's how they reassure themselves they still have leverage. The COO rubbed his face with both hands. We grounded more than 200 aircraft. We've stranded tens of thousands of people. Wall Street is not going to wait patiently for us to feel morally satisfied. David traced a line of numbers with his finger. Deferred inspection. Deferred inspection. Cleared under time pressure. Wall Street reacts to uncertainty, he said. You're giving them clarity. They just don't recognize it yet. The COO laughed softly, a brittle sound. You're remarkably calm for someone who just detonated a quarter's worth of projections. David finally looked up. His gaze was steady, unblinking. This quarter was already lost, he said. You just hadn't priced it in. The door opened again. A woman in communications stepped in, tablet hugged to her chest like a shield. We have confirmation, she said. Media's got the passenger angle. Multiple outlets. They're asking about the man who reported the issue. She glanced at David, then away, unsure whether to name him. He's not the story David said before she could ask. The system is. She nodded, relief flickering across her face. We'll frame it that way. Don't frame it, David corrected. Describe it. Another vibration. David's phone buzzed on the table. He didn't need to look to know who it was. He let it buzz once more before answering. Yes, he said. The voice on the other end was tight. Controlled. Old power adjusting to new gravity. You moved faster than we expected. You waited longer than you should have, David replied. A pause. We're getting calls. So am I. They're asking who authorized this. David leaned back in his chair. Tell them the aircraft did. The line went quiet. Across the terminal, Brian Mitchell sat alone in a small break room that suddenly felt too small to contain him. His uniform jacket lay folded beside him untouched. He stared at the floor, replaying every moment, every inflection, every assumption. The past 20 years compressed into a single point of failure. Emily sat across from him, knees pulled up slightly, coffee cooling in her hands. "They asked me to give a formal statement," she said again, quieter this time. "Not just what I saw, what I thought." Brian swallowed. "What did you say?" "That I thought we were trained to move problems out of sight," she replied. "Not to solve them." Brian closed his eyes. The truth had a weight to it. Once spoken, it didn't leave. "You think they'll fire us?" he asked. Emily considered. "I think they'll fire the idea that experience excuses complacency," she said. "What happens to us depends on whether we help or hide." Brian nodded slowly. For the first time, he didn't feel the urge to defend himself, only to understand. At the far end of the terminal, Thomas Reynolds sat in a private lounge that no longer felt private. The screens around him glowed with headlines he had hoped never to read. Airline halts fleet after safety concerns. Passenger report sparks wider review. He recognized the language. Neutral, cautious. But beneath it, something sharper. His phone rang again. This time, he answered. "I know he said before the other voice could speak. I know how it looks." He listened, jaw tightening. "No, I didn't know who he was." "That's not the point." A pause. "Yes, I understand the optics." He ended the call and stared at his reflection in the darkened screen. For years he had believed proximity to power was the same as power itself. Today had disabused him of that notion. Back in the operations office, the first full diagnostic report arrived. The room leaned in as it was projected onto the wall. Charts, data points, a clear line where a small irregularity had been logged, dismissed, logged again, dismissed again. 3 separate opportunities to catch this, the maintenance director said quietly. 3. The COO exhaled sharply. And we didn't. David stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This isn't about blame," he said. "It's about pattern recognition. You built an organization that rewarded getting airborne. You punished hesitation. This is what that produces." A senior executive bristled. "We can't operate if every anomaly stops the system." "No," David agreed. "You can't operate if every anomaly is ignored." Silence followed. Heavy. Unavoidable. The communications director cleared her throat. "We need to go public," she said, "before speculation fills the gap." David nodded. "Say what happened. Say what you missed. Say what you're changing. Then stop talking." "That's it?" the COO asked. "That's trust," David replied. The press conference was scheduled for later that evening. In the meantime, messages flooded in. Pilots, engineers, cabin crew, some angry, some relieved, some grateful, many saying the same thing in different words. "We've been saying this for years." David read everyone. As the sun dipped lower outside the terminal windows, casting long shadows across the tarmac. The grounded aircraft seemed less like casualties and more like witnesses. Proof that restraint had finally overridden momentum. Emily stood at the edge of the operations room, watching the leaders debate language. She caught David's eye once. He nodded almost imperceptibly. It steadied her. Brian hovered near the doorway, unsure where he belonged now. David approached him quietly. "You still here?" David said. Brian nodded. "I wanted to be." "Good," David replied. "Then listen." Brian's straightened instinct kicking in. "This isn't about redemption," David continued. "It's about reconstruction. If you want a place in what comes next, you'll have to dismantle the habits that protected you." Brian swallowed. "I don't know how to do that." David met his gaze. "You learn by choosing differently when it costs you something." Across the terminal, Thomas Reynolds watched the press podium being assembled. He felt a strange mix of dread and clarity. The world he'd navigated so confidently had revealed a fault line, and once you saw it, you couldn't pretend it wasn't there. David returned to the table as the room quieted. The COO looked at him, eyes tired, searching. "What happens now?" he asked. David glanced at the board where timelines had been erased and rewritten, at the people who would carry this forward long after he stepped away. "Now," he said, "you find out whether you want to be fast or right." Outside, cameras rolled, microphones tested, a system prepared to explain itself to the world. And somewhere beneath the layers of protocol and profit, a different kind of pressure began to build. Not to take off, but to finally tell the truth before something worse forced it into the open. The press conference began with a lie that sounded like truth, not the words themselves, the tone. The CEO stood at the podium beneath the North Sky logo. Shoulders squared, voice steady, explaining precautionary measures and voluntary pauses, a narrative polished enough to slide past scrutiny if no one pushed. Cameras clicked. Reporters nodded. The machine began doing what it had always done. David watched from the back of the room. He hadn't planned to be there. Not like this. But when he heard the phrasing, when he recognized the careful omission, dressed up as transparency, he felt something harden in his chest. Not anger. Resolve. The CEO finished his opening statement. Hands went up. "Is it true a passenger identified the issue?" a reporter asked. "Yes," the CEO said. "We encourage all passengers to report concerns." David shifted his weight. Why wasn't it taken seriously until maintenance intervened? Another voice pressed. The CEO hesitated just a fraction too long. "Our crew followed established protocols. That was the moment." David stepped forward. The room rippled as people noticed movement that hadn't been choreographed. Heads turned. Cameras adjusted. The CEO faltered eyes, flicking toward the side of the stage where no one had told him to look. David didn't ask permission. He took the empty microphone stand beside the podium and spoke before anyone could stop him. "That's not accurate." The room went still. The CEO stared at him, stunned. "Sir." "My name is David Carter," David said. His voice carried without strain. "And the protocols you're referring to failed before maintenance ever arrived." A murmur surged. Reporters leaned forward, hungry now. The CEO's face tightened. "This isn't the time or place." "It is," David said. "Because you're about to tell the public this was an anomaly, It wasn't. The CEO's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced toward the COO, toward legal, toward anyone who could pull David back. No one moved. David continued. The issue wasn't that a passenger noticed something unusual, he said. The issue was that multiple warning signs had been dismissed over time because they were inconvenient, because addressing them would have slowed departures, because the system rewarded confidence more than curiosity. A reporter raised a hand, voice sharp. "Are you an employee of North Sky?" "No," David said. "I'm an investor. And today I was a passenger." The word investor landed like a dropped glass. The CEO recovered enough to interject. "Mr. Carter has been assisting us with an internal review." "I didn't assist," David said. "I observed." The room buzzed. Phones lifted higher. Someone whispered his name into a headset. Somewhere a producer smiled. "This fleet was grounded because patterns were ignored," David said. "Not because one person spoke up. And if you want trust back, you don't get it by smoothing the edges. You get it by showing where you cut corners and why." The CEO's jaw worked. He leaned toward his microphone. "With respect, you're oversimplifying a complex operational reality." David met his eyes. With respect, complexity is not an excuse for repetition. Silence swallowed to the room. At the back, Brian Mitchell watched the exchange on a monitor, heart pounding. He felt exposed even though no one had named him. He recognized himself in every phrase. The habits, the shortcuts, the belief that experience meant instinct, and instinct meant safety. Emily stood beside him, arms crossed, eyes bright with a mix of fear and something like pride. "He's not letting them bury it," she said quietly. "No," Brian replied. "He's letting it breathe." On stage, a reporter called out, "Are you saying this could happen again?" David didn't hesitate. "I'm saying it already has. And it will again, unless you change how decisions are made when no one is watching." The CEO inhaled sharply. "We are implementing corrective measures." "Then name them," David said. The CEO froze. David turned back to the room. "Independent audits. Public reporting of deferred maintenance trends. Crew training that rewards escalation, not silence. And accountability that doesn't stop at the lowest rung." The words were clear, unavoidable. A reporter asked the question everyone had been circling. "Did you intend for this to happen?" David paused. The pause mattered. "No," he said. "I intended to see the truth." The press conference ended in controlled chaos. Microphones thrust forward, voices overlapping. Security finally moving too late to stop what had already spread. David stepped away from the stage, heart steady. The adrenaline ebbed, replaced by the familiar weight of consequence. He knew what he had just done. He had crossed from influence into exposure, from advisor into catalyst. In the hallway, the CEO caught up to him, face flushed. "You blindsided us." David turned. "You were already blind," he said. "I just removed the filter." The CEO lowered his voice. "Do you have any idea what this will cost us?" "Yes," David replied. "Do you have any idea what it would have cost not to?" The CEO stared at him, then looked away, defeated, not by argument, but by inevitability. Outside the terminal roared. News alerts chimed. Passengers pointed. Someone shouted David's name. Another asked for a statement. He kept walking. In a quiet corner near baggage claim, Thomas Reynolds watched the footage replay on a screen above a bar. David's face. Calm. Unyielding. He felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. It was recognition. He had spent years navigating rooms like that, believing he understood power. He saw now how narrow his understanding had been. Brian approached David near the exit, breathless. "They're saying the CEO might step aside," he said. "Temporarily." David nodded. "That's their decision." Brian hesitated. "I wanted to apologize. Publicly." David studied him. "Apologies are private," he said. "Change is public." Brian absorbed that, then nodded. "Then I'll start there." Emily joined them, phone buzzing non-stop. "They want me on record," she said. "My statement's already circulating." David met her gaze. "Tell the truth again," he said. "Consistency is credibility." She straightened shoulders back. "I will." As David stepped outside, the late afternoon light hit him full in the face. He squinted, then relaxed, breathing in the cold air. Planes sat grounded beyond the fence, engines silent. A rare sight, a necessary one. His phone rang. He answered without looking. Yes, the voice on the other end was different now, less cautious, more resigned. "The board's meeting tonight. There's talk of restructuring, of making your role official." David closed his eyes briefly. "No." A pause. "No. No," he repeated. "This doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the system you fix after I leave." Silence stretched, then understood. The call ended. David stood there for a moment longer, watching the sky darken as planes stayed firmly on the ground. He felt the cost settling in. The backlash would come. The lawsuits, the anger, the blame. But beneath it all, something else had begun. A pressure in the opposite direction, not to take off, but to slow down, to listen, to notice. He turned and walked into the crowd, no longer invisible, no longer protected. Carrying with him the uncomfortable truth that once revealed could never be unseen. The backlash didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, each one shaped differently, each one demanding something from him. By morning, David's name was everywhere. Not in headlines yet, in subtext, in opinion columns that asked questions without answers, in analyst notes that danced around blame while quietly recalculating risk. The fleet was still grounded. The silence in the sky had become the story. David sat in a borrowed office overlooking the runway, watching mechanics crawl over aircraft like surgeons over patients. His phone lay face down on the table. He'd stopped counting the missed calls. A knock at the door. "Come in." The door opened to reveal the COO, eyes rimmed red, holding a legal pad filled with hurried handwriting. He looked older than he had the night before. "The unions are calling," the COO said. "Pilots, maintenance, cabin crew. Some are angry, some are relieved. Most are scared." David nodded. "They should be. That's not reassuring. It's honest." The COO exhaled, sinking into a chair. They're afraid this turns into a purge. David leaned back, gaze steady. Then make it a reckoning instead. The COO studied him. You talk like this is survivable. It is, David said. What isn't survivable is pretending you can reset trust without discomfort. The COO hesitated. There's something else. David waited. They're floating the idea of suspending you from further involvement, the COO said carefully. Temporarily. To show independence. David almost smiled. That won't help them. It might calm investors. It might, David agreed. Until the next document leaks. The COO rubbed his temples. You don't make this easy. David's voice was calm. I don't make it worse either. Outside, a group of pilots stood in a loose circle near the crew entrance jackets, zipped faces tight. Brian Mitchell stood with them, no longer in uniform, hands shoved into his pockets like a man unsure where to put himself. He listened more than he spoke. They're acting like this is our fault, one pilot snapped, like we don't fly what they give us. Brian nodded slowly. We also don't push when something feels off, he said. We convince ourselves it's fine, because that's easier than stopping the line. The pilot scoffed. You siding with management now? No, Brian said. I'm siding with gravity. The pilot stared at him, then looked away. Emily stood a few steps back, watching the exchange. Her phone buzzed again. Another request. Another interview. Another chance to shape a narrative she hadn't asked for. She felt the weight of it pressing into her shoulders. She thought of David's words. Consistency is credibility. She stepped forward. This isn't about fault, she said. It's about whether we keep repeating the same mistake because it's familiar. A few heads turned. No one interrupted. Inside the office, David's phone finally rang with a number he didn't ignore. This is becoming political, the voice said. Older. Seasoned. The kind of voice that rarely asked. You need to understand the pressure we're under. I do, David replied. I just don't share your priorities. A pause. You're pushing them into a corner. David stood, walking to the window. Corners reveal structure. You could step back, the voice suggested. Let this resolve. David's reflection stared back at him in the glass. It won't resolve, he said. It will settle. And settling is how this started. The line went quiet. By midday, the leaks began. An internal memo surfaced, time-stamped months earlier, flagging minor anomalies. A risk assessment downgraded after a scheduling meeting. Emails that used words like acceptable and manageable where the word stop should have been. The press pounced. North Sky's stock dipped, then dipped again. Commentators argued whether the grounding was an overreaction or overdue. Safety experts weighed in, voices layered with frustration and vindication. David watched none of it. He read the raw documents instead. There was a knock again. This time the door opened to Captain Sullivan. You wanted to see me, the captain said. David nodded, gesturing to a chair. I wanted to thank you. The captain shook his head. I did my job. You did it when it mattered, David said. That's rarer than it should be. The captain sat hands folded. They're asking me to speak. Publicly. David considered. Do you want to? I want to tell the truth, the captain said. But I don't want to be used. David met his eyes. Then speak once. Say it clearly. Don't embellish. Don't defend. Let the facts stand. The captain nodded. And I'm already being used, David said. That's the cost of standing in the open. Across the airport, Thomas Reynolds sat in his office blinds, half closed, watching the market tick downward on a screen he no longer trusted. He replayed his own words from the plane, hearing them now through a different lens. The entitlement, the certainty, the ease with which he'd assumed the world would bend. His assistant hovered at the door. They're asking if you'll comment. Thomas closed his eyes. Tell them I'm reviewing my position. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I have. Back at the terminal, the first flights scheduled for the next day were officially cancelled. The ripple expanded, hotels filled, tempers flared. But something else happened too. Conversations started that had never been allowed before. Mechanics spoke openly about pressure. Crew members admitted fear of escalation. Managers listened, some reluctantly, some with visible relief. David moved through it all like a fixed point, neither leading nor retreating, present without performing. People projected onto him what they needed. Villain, savior, disruptor. None of it changed what he saw. By evening, the board reconvened. This time the tone was different, less defensive, more brittle. We're considering a leadership change, the COO said quietly. At the top. David leaned forward. That's a decision you need to make for the right reasons. The COO nodded. We are. And don't confuse replacement with reform, David added. Faces don't fix systems. A long silence followed. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the grounded plains in shadow. For the first time since this began, David felt the weight of it all settle fully. Not triumph, responsibility. His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. Thank you for not letting it go. David stared at the words, then typed back a single reply. Neither did you. He set the phone down and looked out at the quiet runway. The night air pressed against the glass. Somewhere, engines were being tested without the intention of flight. Systems learning restraint. The storm hadn't passed, it was still building. But beneath it, something fundamental had shifted. The sky would open again. It always did. What mattered now was whether the ground had learned how to listen before it did. The resignation leaked before it was announced. David learned about it from the way the terminal shifted. Not from a screen or a call, but from the posture of people who had been bracing for impact, and suddenly realized the ground beneath them was actually moving. Conversations hushed. Phones came out, then went quiet again, like no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. The CEO was stepping aside. Interim. Temporary. Language chosen carefully. But the message was clear enough to anyone who had spent time near power. Something had broken its seal. David stood near the windows, watching a maintenance crew roll a hydraulic cart away from an aircraft that had been grounded longer than the others. The plane looked intact, clean, ready. That was the danger. Systems often failed not when they looked broken, but when they looked good enough to trust. The COO approached him slowly, hands empty, shoulders no longer squared for battle. "It's official," he said. "He's gone." David didn't turn. "He stepped aside," he said. "Those are different things." For now, the COO admitted. "The board wants stability." "They always do," David replied. "It's what they call silence when it benefits them." The COO nodded, tired. "They also want to know what comes next." David finally faced him. "What comes next doesn't need me in front of it. That's not how they see it." "That's the problem," David said. Across the terminal, Brian Mitchell watched the news break on a muted television above a bar that hadn't opened yet. The headline crawled slowly across the screen, each word landing heavier than the last. Leadership transition amid safety review. He felt no relief, just exposure, the kind that stripped excuses down to bone. Emily joined him, arms folded tight against herself. "They're calling it a turning point," she said. Brian let out a breath. "Turning points are only useful if you turn." She glanced at him. "What are you going to do?" Brian stared at the screen, then looked away. "I'm going to tell them everything he said. Not just what happened. Why it kept happening." Emily nodded once. "Good." At the edge of the crowd, Thomas Reynolds read the same headline on his phone, then closed his eyes. He had spent his career reading signals early. This one he'd missed. Or worse, ignored. He typed a message, erased. It typed again. "We need to talk." He didn't send it. Inside a makeshift briefing room, the board reconvened with new faces at the head of the table and the same unease beneath it. Lawyers lined the walls. Consultants took notes that would later become recommendations no one wanted to own. The interim CEO cleared her throat. "We need to address the perception that this was triggered by a single passenger." David sat back, listening. "That narrative is dangerous," she continued. "It suggests fragility. It suggests accountability," David said calmly. She met his gaze. "We can't appear reactive." "You can't afford to appear dismissive," David replied. "Choose which illusion you want." A murmur followed. Not disagreement. Recognition. The interim CEO folded her hands. "We want you to chair an independent oversight committee." David shook his head. "No." A beat. "No. No," he repeated. "If I chair it, every decision becomes suspect. I'll nominate people who aren't invested in being liked by you or feared by the market." The lawyers shifted. The consultants looked up. "And if we don't agree?" someone asked. David leaned forward. "Then you'll ground yourselves the next time this happens, and next time you won't get a warning." Silence settled. Heavy. Decisive. Outside, the first formal interviews aired. Emily watched one on her phone, volume low. Her own words, clipped and steady, played back to her. She looked younger on screen, more vulnerable. But there was steel in her eyes she hadn't noticed before. "They didn't twist it," she said to Brian. Brian nodded. "They didn't need to." Across the runway, a test engine roared to life briefly, then shut down. The sound echoed unfinished like a thought interrupted. David's phone buzzed again. This time, he answered immediately. "Yes." The voice was quieter now, less guarded. "We're seeing support from places we didn't expect." David closed his eyes. People who've been waiting. Yes, the voice said. And resistance. Of course. A pause. They're asking about your past, your record, your motivations. David smiled faintly. Let them. You're comfortable with scrutiny. I'm comfortable with patterns, David replied. They reveal themselves eventually. The call ended. As evening fell, the terminal thinned. Flights were still cancelled. Travelers found hotels or couches or resigned patients. The crisis settled into something longer, deeper. David walked the length of the concourse once more, unnoticed now, in the way that mattered. People were no longer staring at him. They were talking to each other. About procedures, about choices, about what they'd seen and what they'd ignored. Near the exit, Thomas Reynolds finally approached him, shoulders stiff, eyes uncertain. I should have spoken up, Thomas said. No preamble, no defense. David studied him. You didn't think it was your place. Thomas nodded. I thought my place protected me from consequences. David's voice was even. It protected you from listening. Thomas winced but didn't look away. I don't want that anymore. David considered him. The pause stretched uncomfortable but necessary. Then stop buying silence with familiarity, he said. It's expensive. Thomas nodded slowly. I will. Outside, the night air pressed in cool and sharp. The airport lights cast long reflections across the tarmac, illuminating rows of aircraft still grounded, still waiting. David stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, listening to the low hum of generators and the distant murmur of voices. The system was still resisting. It always did. But something fundamental had shifted. This time the pause wasn't denial. It was choice, and for the first time in a long while, the ground beneath the planes felt steady enough to deserve the sky again. The first plane to fly again did not make the news. That was intentional. David learned about it from a quiet message sent before dawn. One aircraft, one route. No press, no speeches. Just a crew that had been briefed differently. Maintenance logs reviewed line by line, and a captain who had signed his name slowly, deliberately, after asking questions that would have annoyed people a week earlier. David stood at the window of the hotel room North Sky had booked for him, and watched the lights of the city fade into early morning grey. The sky was empty in a way it hadn't been in days, not peaceful, expectant. The system was testing itself. Down in operations, the mood had changed from panic to vigilance. Less noise, more listening. The whiteboards were still full, but now they held names instead of deadlines, questions instead of targets. Engineers spoke without being cut off. Pilots asked for clarification without apology. It was not comfortable. That was how David knew it was real. The interim CEO joined him later that morning, her expression controlled but strained. The trial flight landed, she said. No issues. David nodded. One data point. She exhaled. We're scheduling another. And another, David said. With different crews, different routes, different pressures. She hesitated. The board is worried about momentum. David looked at her. Momentum is what broke you. She didn't argue. In a conference room down the hall, Brian Mitchell sat at a long table with no head. That had been deliberate, too. He wasn't in uniform. Just a plain shirt, sleeves rolled, hands folded like a man finally ready to be seen without armor. Across from him sat 3 people he had never spoken to directly in 20 years. Maintenance, safety review. A pilot who'd flown longer than Brian had been alive. "We're not here to assign blame," the pilot said. "We're here to map behavior." Brian swallowed. "Then start with mine." He spoke slowly at first, then faster as the dam broke. About shortcuts that became habits. About confidence mistaken for competence. About how often he'd resolved tension by moving people instead of confronting systems. Each sentence felt like stepping onto thin ice, but the ice held. No one interrupted. Emily watched through the glass, heart pounding. She had already given her statement twice. This felt different. Less like testimony, more like construction. Her phone buzzed, a message from a reporter asking if she felt vindicated. She didn't reply. Across town, Thomas Reynolds sat in his office with the door closed, a rare thing for a man who had always preferred visibility. A letter lay open on his desk. His own words. A resignation from an advisory board he had once considered a symbol of arrival. He reread the last line before signing it. "Effective immediately." His assistant hovered nearby. "Are you sure?" Thomas nodded. "I've been certain for years," he said quietly. "I just didn't like what it required." The letter slid into an envelope. A small sound. Final. Back at the airport, David walked the concourse with the interim CEO, watching how people moved now. Slower. More deliberate. He noticed a gate agent pause before answering a question, choosing accuracy over speed. He noticed a mechanic refuse to clear a checklist until a second pair of eyes confirmed it. Small things. "They're watching you," the interim CEO said. David didn't look at her. "They're watching the change," he said. "I'm just standing near it." She stopped walking. "You could leave," she said. "Soon. Let us handle the rest." David turned. "Will you?" She met his gaze. "Yes." He studied her face, the tension, the resolve beneath it. "Then I will," he said. "But not today." News finally broke that afternoon. Not about David, about North Sky. A measured article. No heroes, no villains, just a system forced to slow down and look at itself. Analysts argued, commentators speculated. The stock moved, then stabilized. David read none of it. Instead, he sat with a group of mechanics in a break room that smelled like oil and coffee, listening to stories that had never been told in boardrooms. About pressure, about fear, about near misses that became jokes because no one wanted them to become reports. He didn't interrupt. He didn't promise anything. He just listened. That night, another plane flew. Then another. Each one logged. Each one reviewed. Each one signed off by people who now understood that their names meant something. Brian stood on the tarmac as one took off. Hands shoved deep in his pockets. He felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter without the weight of pretending. Heavier with the responsibility of knowing better. Emily joined him. "They asked me to stay," she said. "Long term." Brian nodded. "You should." "I will," she said. But not quietly. He smiled. "I didn't think you would." David watched from a distance, invisible again, in the way that mattered. He felt the familiar pull to leave, to step back into the margins where influence did not require attention. His phone buzzed one last time that evening. "The board wants to thank you," David typed back. "Fix it." "That's thanks enough." He shut the phone off and slipped it into his pocket. Outside, the night sky filled slowly with movement, planes rising one by one, not rushing, not racing, but lifting with intention. The sound was different now, less frantic, more measured. David stood still, breathing it in. This was not an ending. It was a hinge, a narrow point where something heavy had shifted direction. He knew the temptation would come, to forget, to speed up, to smooth edges again. Systems always drifted back toward comfort if no one held them. But he also knew something else now lived inside this place. A memory of what it felt like when the sky went quiet, when the ground demanded attention. That memory would outlast him. And that was the point. The gate reopened without ceremony, just a soft chime and a subtle shift in posture as people realized this flight would actually leave. David Carter stepped into the line with everyone else. No escort, no priority lane. His boarding pass folded once creased at the center, like he had done 1,000 times before. The terminal smelled of coffee and carpet cleaner, the familiar scent of movement and waiting. Around him, travelers carried the quiet fatigue of delay, but something else moved beneath it now. Awareness. Eyes that lingered. Conversations that had softened. A man 2 places ahead turned and nodded, not in recognition, but in acknowledgement. A shared moment survived the chaos. David returned it with the smallest lift of his chin. At the aircraft door, the flight attendant met his eyes and smiled. Not the rehearsed kind. The real one that reached the corners. She welcomed him the same way she welcomed the woman behind him. The same tone, the same patience. David noticed. He always did. Inside the cabin, the sound had changed. No rushed announcements, no clipped commands, just steady movement, methodical and calm. A child pointed out the window, whispering about the wing. The mother hushed him gently, but the attendant leaned down anyway. Listened, nodded, explained. The child beamed. David closed his eyes for a moment and let the image settle. This was the result no press release could manufacture. He took his seat and felt the vibration of the aircraft beneath him alive, but contained. The captain's voice came over the intercom, measured, grounded. Not inspiring, reassuring. The kind of voice that didn't need applause. As the plane pushed back, David felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear. Memory. The echo of a night when the sky had gone silent and the ground had demanded accountability. He opened his eyes and watched the runway lights slide past each one, a marker of distance earned, not assumed. Across the aisle, Emily stood with her hands clasped behind her back, watching the cabin with a focus that bordered on reverence. She caught David's eye and nodded once, a promise kept. Brian was not on this flight. That mattered too. Absence could be accountability when chosen correctly. The plane lifted smoothly, no drama, just physics and trust working together. The city fell away, the clouds opened, the cabin exhaled as one. Mid-flight. David stood and stretched, then walked back toward the galley. Not to test, but to observe. A passenger flagged down a crew member about a noise near the back. The response was immediate and respectful. Notes were taken. The cockpit was informed. The process unfolded without tension. No one rolled their eyes. No one minimized. David returned to his seat and let the relief wash through him slowly. Not victory. Verification. When the plane landed, the applause did not come. That, too, was a sign of maturity. People gathered their belongings with the quiet efficiency of those who trusted the machine they were inside. As they filed out, a few offered David a smile. A few offered nothing. Equality looked like that, too. In the jet bridge, sunlight filtered through glass panels, painting long lines on the floor. David paused to let others pass, then stepped forward into the terminal. The airport hummed indifferent to individual narratives, but something had shifted in its rhythm. Outside, a small group waited. Not reporters, workers, mechanics, gate agents, a pilot in a worn jacket. They didn't approach all at once. They didn't need to. The pilot spoke first. "We're doing it differently now." David nodded. "Keep doing it," he said. No speeches. No slogans. Emily joined them, her badge turned inward, her shoulders squared. "There's more work," she said. "There always is," David replied. He walked away then, blending back into the current of travelers, his role complete for now. Influence did not require permanence. It required timing. Later, as evening settled and the airport lights brightened against the darkening sky, David sat alone near a window and watched another plane rise. Then another. Each one carrying people who would never know his name and never need to. That was the measure of success. He thought of the night everything stopped, of the sound of silence in a place built on motion, of how quickly comfort could become danger when no one questioned it, of how dignity, once treated as optional, had proven essential. The world did not change because one man refused to move seats. It changed because a system was forced to listen and chose not to forget. David stood and adjusted his jacket. Somewhere behind him, a television played coverage of delayed flights and recovered schedules. Somewhere ahead, a child pressed a face to glass, watching engines hum. The future moved forward, uneven but awake. As he walked toward the exit, his reflection passed briefly in the glass. Just another traveler. That was enough. If this story moved you, show your support with a like, subscribe for more stories like this, and comment these 3 words: stand your ground.